Pizza people, welcome back. Hollywood Pizza here, and I'm joined by HamHocks42 and OhOneNine, and we've got another episode of the Cold Pizza Podcast. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Doing
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
Ready to
Phenomenal.
talk about some magic.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Can't wait.
We've got quite a lot on the plate, correct?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
a lot of good topics for tonight for sure.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
for
we
sure.
might I feel like tonight might be a little bit divisive in our approaches to deck building and our just kind of theories about the game in general.
It's possible, but hey, if we can bring a variety of perspectives to the table, I think that could lead to a good discussion. So I'm looking forward to it.
That's right.
Definitely. So in today's video, today's podcast, essentially we're going to be talking a lot about deck building in general. We're going to go over deck building archetypes. We're going to talk about, running specific copies of cards, a little bit of sideboarding, and kind of just like metagaming in general. Um, you know, Deck building is like very broad. When someone says deck building, it could literally just mean like anything, really, in terms of Magic too. A lot of people brew. A lot of people, they try to grind as many games as they can. Um, I know that you guys brew a lot more than I do. I don't necessarily brew too much myself a lot of the time. I'm being pretty straightforward here. A lot of time I get a deck list from somewhere or somebody, and that's what I'm playing. I don't know. I think that even in that, like for me, I find myself brewing that deck sometimes where I'm like, I don't really like maybe the direction that they went. Even if they had success, if I'm not having success with it, then maybe I'm trying to figure out, different ways to approach the deck. And on top of that, maybe I want to try to build the deck more to how I like it. I think that there's like specific strategies that kind of do that, like mid range. Mid range kind of like can be anything that you want it to be. Control is kind of the same, right? Like if you're a control player, then you can kind of at least get an idea of like what cards you want to put in your deck and how you want to answer your opponent, because you're also going to have the knowledge of when you know to turn the game around, things like that. Whereas like maybe someone who isn't as versed in the deck will be playing more copies of specific cards because, they feel like that version is going to be a lot more smoother, a lot more forgiving. Whereas, sometimes having like those one or two ofs and them showing up, you not knowing when to play them at the right time can kind of burn you, especially when you don't necessarily know your deck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. I mean, there's a lot to the idea of brewing, and if for any Magic player, I mean, so you mentioned the idea of like deck building is such a broad topic because obviously Commander players deck building means one thing. Limited players deck building means something very different, and then you have the constructed folks who play more standard or older formats, Explorer, Pioneer, whatever the case may be. All of those require different approaches in order to be successful. But I know one thing that I find when I'm building a deck, whether that's based on a series of draft picks, whether that's based on cards I have lying around and I'm trying to put a commander deck together, or whether that's trying to craft something that can be competitive on the arena ladder, what I always try to do is identify what is my deck trying to do. If I cannot summarize what the deck is trying to do in one, maybe two sentences, it's trying to do too much and I need to tone it back.
Right.
That's been something that I've come to realize. If I can't give somebody an elevator pitch of what my deck is supposed to do in about 15 seconds, it's too complicated and I need to change it up. And we've all had those decks, right? Where you have like a weird 4-card combo where you really want to see this weird Rube Goldberg machine pop off. And at the end of the day, it's like, maybe I need to just whittle this down and try to find support cards that can help this one piece of the strategy fire. And then you find it's much more consistent and you win more games, So find the simplest approach. And when it comes to deck building as well, Pizza, one thing you commented on, something you kind of touched on there, approach the game however you want. If you don't enjoy deck building, net deck, do it. We're all content creators here. Copy our deck list. That's why we post them. We want you to play with our lists and tweak them and modify them. So what you're saying is you can do a deck build that is just tuning somebody else's list so it fits your play style and where you think that deck should be going. And as a result, you could make 4 or 5 changes, and that may not sound like a lot, but it can make a massive difference and can really shift and maybe take that deck that somebody else maybe pioneered and really take it to the next level. So there is an art in that. That's really cool. Like, you're not doing anything wrong because you originally took somebody else's list and worked off of it. That's fine.
Right. Yeah, and I think there you're of course speaking specifically about constructed, in regardless of the format. But yeah, there's no lost pride in taking someone else's previous work, and then downloading it or copying it, and then looking at it and applying your own kind of flavor to it. There's a lot of people, and I'd be interested to see what the two of you have to think about this, about people's propensity to play certain type of decks and how that's reflective of their personality. Now, some
Mm,
people probably read into that a little bit too deeply, and then the person who plays a lot of Magic would say, "Well, I have every type of archetype. I play all the things because if one of them lands, or if one of them, happens to kind of resonate with me, regardless of what I have come into with my predetermined assumption about what I enjoy playing, as soon as something clicks, I've had that happen actually frequently. Recently, if I could mention, I don't consider myself primarily a hyper aggro player. But a list went out not too long ago with a new anthology set in MTG Arena that included Lyelia, and that historic mono red burn deck was just such a thumper and such a consistent way of, if you're in the mood to do that, to just grind the ladder. And it was, it had an aggressive 60-70% win rate. It's like, why not? Adjust your gameplay style. So many people identify, and we see it on, platforms like Twitter and Discord and stuff like that, where they're like, I am a blank player. I am a blue player. I'm a red player. I'm a green player. But in reality, it's like, don't allow that to deny you the opportunity to play something you're not typically comfortable with. I mentioned in the
mhm,
past that my kind of typical side of the color wheel that I gravitate towards is black or black and white. Not just because of recent things, which I'm sure we'll get into here with standard, but just all the way going back. The first deck I ever made, I think, was Pestilence. So I mean, I've always been a black player, but I saw the line, so to speak, and I saw the how successful the deck was, and I said, you know what, why not? Let's change uh, the way in which I normally approach the game, and recognize a good deck when it's just there and available.
Yeah, for me at least, I usually play the best deck, or I usually gravitate specifically towards green red. But I myself have over time, when I played in paper, I always wanted to have a lot of cards because I always wanted to play like everything. This channel specifically is like reflective of that, where it's like I'm not really trying to be just like a one trick pony. It's more like, hey, look, we can showcase every single deck. Every week we can talk about what's the most popular. Then the following weeks maybe we talk about stuff that isn't as big. Tier 2, tier 3 strategies. Maybe kind of give a little bit more information on like everything overall. Um, I think it's more dependent on what you're trying to do. Like it for me, it's when I'm trying to grind the ladder. When I actually, if I want to play arena ranked,
Mhm.
then for the content, it's gonna be whatever, right? Any deck that I want to play, right? Pretty much,
mhm,
Okay.
right? Mono blue to mono red to whatever, right? Combo decks, whatever. But um, if I actually wanted to rank up, like let's say I wanted to get to Mythic, then I'm gonna play like a hyper aggressive deck, like red deck, mono green, something that's gonna give me some quick wins, just like the fight rigging decks we're doing too. Something that just slaps, gets me there super quick. Angels was like that too, where I just get there and now I'm a Mythic, I can kind of like mess around or whatever. But
Right.
paper was a little bit different, where I really did try to play usually what was like close to the best deck, if not the best deck, because when you're grinding tournaments and stuff, at least once you get to know that deck, it gives you the highest chance of essentially like trying to spike the tournament, or at least have like the best odds against a lot of other players, especially people who aren't, haven't played quote unquote as many games as you. But I think for me, it really comes down to like what I'm trying to do at the time. But in terms of like where I've been in the color pie, at least for me, like in the beginning, it was always like red, and then I went towards black. Slowly became a green player, and then now I'm mostly just like green, red, aggressive type player usually. I still like the mid range. I try to get back into the mid range as much as I can because I
Sure.
was a big Siege Rhino player.
Well, I
And
was going to
Jund
ask
player.
you.
I
I was
like I guess identify as Jund. Like if I'm gonna be something, it's gonna be Jund probably.
Jund or Abzan. I was going to ask
Yeah,
you, by
Jund
the
or
way, since
Abzan.
you brought it up, do you believe in the concept of a pet deck, or
Yeah.
do either of you have a deck? And I have one of my own. I'll save my answer for the end. But do you have currently, or have you ever had a deck that you know is bad, but you're convinced that if you just work on it a little bit longer, it'll be better, and not just like a flash in the pan thing. You tinker with something, you throw it away. I'm saying something that's lived with you for now at least a year, and you're like, okay, if I just get a little bit more action, if they just reprint this card in this format, I'll have the opportunity. I'll save my answer for the end, but I don't know, Pizza. What do you have a pet deck that you still covet and you try and make great?
I it wasn't like a homebrew or anything, but I played Modern for a long, long time. Um, and I played a variety of decks. The last deck that I ended up playing, before I got back into it last year was Eldrazi, and I was like really heavy into that deck at the time. That I originally was playing it, it was like a tier one deck. It wasn't the best deck, but it was up there.
Yep.
Um, and I got out of like paper for a while. Obviously, been playing arena, so there's no modern. I haven't really seen how things were affected. The Horizon sets came out, so last year I got back into it, and I built a lot of the old school decks. Like I built Tron, I built Eldrazi Tron. Obviously, they're kind of share a lot of same cards. Red deck wins. Some of these like old timey modern strategies that essentially were really good in the past, and Burn's still really good.
Yep.
But you could tell that like the Tron decks themselves had lost a lot of power because the new cards were so much more powerful. Like you could slam a Karn and it wouldn't really matter as much as it used to. Whereas back in the day, it was like, oh, turn three Karn, oh, that's game over. But now it's, I don't know, Magic's like a lot different now, and I still tried to play Etron like a few weeks in a row, but then I kind of just like gave up on it because I was like, man, like this deck was good 3 years ago, but you know, in 3 years of time, like Magic has definitely evolved. Like the Modern's like a funny format because of that reason, where for a long time we have had some cornerstones of the format, and then now we got all these new cards coming in, and it's kind of like shaking it up to the point where like none of those old decks are like good anymore. They can't. It's not even just Modern Horizons. It's like every set that comes out is so much more powerful. So it's definitely taken its toll. But for me, pet decks, I think Etron for a long time.
Etron.
In fact, I was an Infect player, and then after they banned it, I still played it for a long time. Just like these crazy broken decks that I always liked playing stuff that. So a lot of the time, uh, in Modern specifically, like you'll play a fetch land, and depending on what fetch land you play, your opponent can kind of like guess a little bit more, like what you're playing,
Right.
to a certain degree. But I always like playing some of the decks that your opponent couldn't really know, or your opponent knew right away to the point that it tilted them a lot. Like Tron and Infect both do that, where if you play like a Tron land and then a map, your opponent's immediately like
Right.
feeling a
Right.
certain way, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
they
You
could
could
probably
argue the
get,
same is true with Bogles too, right?
yeah, exactly, yeah. Bogles,
Mhm.
Yeah.
Infect, where you crack your fetch,
Yeah. Or
you
Red
you
Prison.
play your Bogle, you play your Glistener
Yeah.
Elf,
Yeah.
yeah,
Simian Spirit Guide into
in the
Blood Moon, and you're
Chalice,
like, okay, cool.
yeah,
I
you
guess we're
play a
doing
Chalice
this.
on one, and then they just
Mhm.
can't.
Chalice on one. Yeah.
I used to do that with Etron a lot. You just turn two Chalice on one, and then you just wait till turn four or turn three. You just Tron, and then you can Chalice on two, and then now the game's just like pretty much locked out for your opponent. And
Well, and you
those terrible
mentioned Modern.
strategies. I like stuff like that. I'm terrible when it comes to
I would
tabletop.
say
Sometimes I don't want my opponent to play Magic. That's what
you
it comes down
mentioned
to.
Modern Horizons 2, and part of the reason those decks don't have the same potency anymore, even though Tron, of course, is still great. It's still
7
definitely
mana with 3 lands. I mean, that's still
yeah.
pretty busted.
However, in
solid.
Modern,
Yeah.
you mentioned, and we'll probably come back to Modern Horizons 2 here in a second, just because of what a ridiculous set it was. But they printed dedicated hate cards because Wizards recognized what the meta was and wanted to give people the opportunity to sideboard to it. So they printed a card, Voidmere, which was absolutely a Tron hate card. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell for
Oh
2
yeah,
colorless.
I
It's an
remember that
artifact.
card. Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
an
They're
artifact.
oh, everyone's frustrated with Tron, whether it be green, colorless,
It
or
was mostly
Eldrazi,
an
like you're
E-Tron
talking.
hate because Tron still has green mana. It can make
Right,
green mana. It
right,
has other ways of dealing with it, but E-Tron specifically
right.
started to play Urborg or the Gaia's
Yep.
land just to be able to actually
Right.
combat that card specifically. I remember someone played it against me, and I was like, "Oh, so this is what Chalice feels like, huh?"
Yeah, that card. I remember when that card came out because I remember seeing Modern players on Twitter going, "Holy crap, they did it! This is it!" And I remember as a standard and EDH player looking at it like, "What do I do with this?" Like,
Yeah,
what?
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Ham, then same question, I guess. Do you have a pet deck, or have you had a pet deck in the past that you recognize as it being sub tier 1, but
hmm
you refuse to give it up?
Yes, I have a whole archetype that I absolutely adore that hasn't been the bee's knees in standard in a very, very, very long time. If you've watched any number of my streams, you've probably seen me trying to shoehorn this into metas where it has no business being there, and that is Reanimator. I love Reanimator strategies. There's something about them, mainly because, well, actually, I think Pizza, you and I might be gravitating towards different things for the same reason. I love it. I love being unfair. I love cheating,
Oh, it
and
feels so good.
Reanimator gives you that. It lets you get out 7, 8, 9 drops for 2 mana or 3 mana if you've
Yeah,
got
yep.
decent enough cards, or 1. I remember one of the, and I think the reason that it really popped for me was I got very lucky with some early cards. When I was first starting out, there's a lot of really good stuff that I found in various LGS bargain bins, because I'm pretty sure the owners didn't know what they had. And so I remember in just a kitchen table janky game, which I guess it was type 1 at the time. Like, we were playing with
Oh my
legacy ban
gosh.
lists. It was not, my deck was not tuned by any means. If I were to go look and actually look at those lists, I'd be like, ugh, what was this? But the crazy gnarly turns happened every now and then where I was able to Dark Ritual into an Entomb, put a Chroma, Angel of Vengeance in my graveyard, and then with my floating mana, hit Reanimate and pull it out, and then swing
Yep,
before my
already
opponent
coming
even
in.
I
before my
mean,
opponent even had an opportunity to play the game.
So
I mean,
brutal, dude.
you just described most
So
people's
brutal.
first experience with Legacy.
that moment when
Mhm.
you're just like, did that just happen? Am I
Yeah.
doing this? Like, it feels so good when that fires, and Reanimator gives you that. And I try to find those moments. Now, Wizards knows how powerful reanimation strategies
Of course.
are. So the idea of like a reprint of something like Animate Dead into Standard will never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, ever happen again. We can hope, right? They do, however, fill our graveyards in very good ways
Yes, they do.
right now. So we have like Old Stick Fingers,
Right.
Rutstein, Celestis, Cathartic Pyre, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, all these great tools that can upfill the graveyard, but getting stuff out is pretty tricky. And so the big deck for me that I kept going back to that I just could not give up in standard prior to rotation was various flavors of Golgari Reanimator. Running Old Stick Fingers, Burning Rune Demon, with the goal of reanimating a Velumachus, and then on attacks, spinning into
Right.
another reanimation spell and grabbing Coma.
Nice. Yeah, well,
Which,
and
Oh,
yeah.
Coma.
it was
What a
possible.
card. What a
And that was the
magic
thing.
card.
With Return Upon the Tide, if you hit the nut draws, you could, on turn 4, pull out Velumachus, attack, pull Coma out, and it's just, the game is over. Like, my opponent's
Yeah.
usually scooped. Because it's turn 4. If I'm on the play, they haven't even untapped with 3 lands yet. And I have Coma and Velumachus on the field. Like,
Yeah.
what can they do?
I,
But
I,
and when you hear that, it might sound like that's you don't think that deck is good. How could you not think that deck is good? The problem is that sequence to get there
Right.
is so specific. The
Right.
win rate on that deck was, I mean, to be fair, actually, I did get to Mythic with that deck one season. So it wasn't terrible. At least at its peak, it wasn't terrible. But I tried so many different iterations of it, and the thing is, reanimation in general is very inconsistent. When it
Right.
doesn't fire, it does nothing, and you just get steamrolled most of the time. Um,
Or you hold
yeah.
your reanimate spell. I was gonna say for not just Golgari but Sultai reanimate.
Hmm.
I always feel like Sultai as a tribe or gate or whatever, as a clan, Sultai is always doing the most unfair things because, and it may be flavored a little bit in the past about 4 years, because they have the best ultimatum, right? There's a lot of good ultimatums. Every time
Hmm.
I look at the Mardu ultimatum, by the way, I'm like, why have I never played this?
I've, ac-
Destroy.
I've I've run
Go
that
ahead.
in a couple of decks when I
Uh,
can cheat it out.
yeah. Because like it's
Yeah.
like destroy all of your opponent's non-land permanents. You're like, how have I never seen this spell resolved
Hmm.
ever in the client? But yeah, I
And
feel
there's
like
a sweet animation in Arena, by the way,
oh,
when
is
you
it?
hit.
See,
Yeah.
okay, I'll say that as an aside real quick about the fact that we don't get cool animations anymore in the arena client. But I was gonna say, yeah, what you're talking about for like Reanimator, it's like Sultai just does all the unfair things. And
Hmm.
the great thing about Sultai is because you have blue, you have access to counters to be able to cover it. Because the problem with a little bit, I would say my second favorite. If I were to answer the question myself, I also love Reanimator, but my flavor is a little bit of a self-hate version as well because I run the Mardu variant. And again,
Mm.
for those of you who know, I primarily only ever on stream play limited, and then if I do play any amount of constructed, it's going to be something like historic. And in historic, the Mardu Reanimator is a very good deck. The problem is, both you guys had mentioned consistency and exposure to counter spells. So that the reason I think Sultai is so much better, but I just refuse to acknowledge it, which is I think the what constitutes it being a pet deck is that blue also has access to counter spells to cover because what you have is you're building up, and if your opponent has a brain between their ears, they're going to see what you're doing, and they're going to see you filling your graveyard, particularly if you're a certain color set, and they're going to hold up whatever counter spell they have or whatever interaction they have to deny your bomb that's going to hit the board. Blue has the ability to load up the graveyard, have that reanimate spell, and maybe have one extra blue open for a spell pierce. Mardu does not have that. I mean, we have Mana Tithe in Historic, which is a meme and is not reliable enough to hold up. But otherwise, yeah, I think that constitutes. But I would say for pet decks, if I were to answer myself for that question, I refuse to believe that mono black discard in any format is not the best. I've been running it since the very beginning, since I've been enjoying it, and to this day, if I look through my deck list on the Arena client, or on MTG Online, or in paper, I have some shell of a typically Liliana focused, not just the most recent one, but any Liliana Planeswalker focused Waste Not, Thoughtseize, Duress, discard that has some absurd top end, like a one single bomb spell. But the whole point of the deck is just to have your opponent empty-handed the whole game until you get to the one thing you want just to win off the top. I refuse to believe that it's actually not as competitive as I believe it is because all the cards are so good. You're thinking to yourself, okay, well, Thoughtseize and Fatal Push and Waste Not and Liliana, these are all fantastic cards. But the reality is that the game has become so diverse. I think part of the reason that Rakdos is so dominant in nearly every format now, uh, certainly Explorer, I think there's no one who would argue that it's not the best deck, if not among the best decks in the format, is the fact that it has such diverse ways of beating you. They're going to beat you on enchantments, creatures, planeswalkers, spells that go damage to your face. They have things that interact with the graveyard. So I think the trouble with such a singularly focused thing like discard is that it lacks the diversity to be able to adapt to what the game state is. But you know what? I refuse to believe it. And that's why it's a pet deck, is why it will always be there and it'll always be lingering in my deck list. And, late at night, when the lights go down and I'm in the dark of my room, I play it and I'm like, yes, today's the day. Today is the day when discard will rise again.
That's a great one. Because yeah, hand hate when it works is so just backbreaking. Like if you hit the right threats, I mean, there's nothing more demoralizing than sitting there with a sweet 5-drop in your hand. You know you're gonna hit it next turn, and your opponent rips that Thoughtseize, or they hit
Yeah,
the Duress. It's the worst.
it's the
Or
worst.
you've got 2 cards in hand. You're like, okay, next turn, I got the win next turn. and then they hit you with the mind rot style effect. Like, well, but but yeah,
Well,
it feels
and then
bad.
the thing
Yeah.
is, it's actually more effective in. It's even worse in eternal formats like Legacy because typically those decks are running something on the order of like 16 lands. You know,
Mm,
they're running a real tight list at most 20. Most of the
wow.
times about 16, 18. And they run a real tight list. And also, almost all of them have a full set of Force of Will, which requires you to, in response to countering it, exile or discard a card from your hand. So their hand is an incredible asset. You know, they're typically just 1 to 3 lands on board is their relative happy state. You know, some of the best decks, Delver and stuff like that, operate off of 1 or 2 lands. You think, how is
Mm,
this possible? But if you're able to pick apart things like their brainstorms and their EIs and things like that to let them refill their hand, they're left with nothing to do. So it's funny is the
Wasteland's really
more
good too. You can kind of just like grind them out. Uh, it's a pretty like attrition-y type situation, and it is weird that those decks can function off of like such low mana compared to standard where like, well, if you miss a land drop you probably lose the game.
yeah, yeah, right, right,
Even later
right.
in the game, if you don't hit like six
mm-hmm.
7 mana, you're like, oh, I don't get to double spell. Well, that's a shame. Now I can't use my
Right.
mana efficiently, and I'm not going over the top of my opponent. Now I lose because they're gonna get the
Mm-hmm.
untap, and if they do two things, it's so
Mhm.
weird. Like in it kind of goes back to like what we talked about with modern and the modern horizons and stuff, where like it's funny that some of these older cards are still that powerful, but a lot of them have more to do either with cheating in mana or drawing lots of cards.
Right,
There's
right, right.
almost like
Mm-hmm.
not really too much of an in between anymore. Creatures, essentially, you can just play anything at this point that's been printed in the last 2 years in your deck, and you could just win with it. I mean, you're like, oh look, I just play like a regular control deck with questing beast. It's like, yeah, that's fine. That card, it's got like pseudo unblockability. It can kill your player and the planeswalkers, and
Yeah,
that's just an example. You know what I mean? Like it's so
right.
funny how everything's like caught up, and then even to the I believe you're essentially talking about like legacy here. Like even in like legacy's sake, if I play something like a questing beast, my opponent's probably not expecting it, and if I got rid of their force of will, another counterspell, they're probably like, oh crap, I just lose to this because I will need to double block, and that's going to be like most of my cards.
Well, I
Um,
mean, that's why Delver is such a big
Yeah,
deal in those older formats, right? Because like a 3/2 flyer,
for
and then
one,
all the disruption. That's all I need.
yep.
Like that's yeah.
that's it. That's all it takes.
Turn one,
And I
play
actually
this,
tried to.
protect it with my counter spells.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Yeah,
keep it
Yeah, the
I
going.
idea
tr-
of playing a 1-drop and still having a counter spell up.
ugh,
Or two counter spells. You're like, oh, I got a daze too. You're like,
you
ah,
got days. Yeah,
I can
exactly.
force will.
I'm
Oh,
gonna.
you did something else. I'll
Yeah,
just daze you. And
I'm gonna pick up that island because I have a lotus petal on board, so I don't care. I
right.
don't. I can operate off of 0 lands. Imagine being a functioning deck and you're able to operate off of 0 lands on board because you're able to do things like you said, like days, pick up your island. Who cares? Force of will. Pitch another blue spell on hand, and then just it's ridiculous.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a great point. When it comes to deck building, when you are looking down, a question that I get pretty frequently is just how many lands should I include?
Right.
And if somebody's just asking generally how many lands should I include in a deck, I can't answer that. Like I need to know more. If you're running, it's really important to know your average mana value, um what kind of strategy you're running, how important is it to hit additional land drops later in the game,
they're like, damn it,
whether that's
Ham. I
going to be
just wanted to
triggering
build my
effects.
sliver deck. Come on,
I
Ham.
know.
Now I'm just
Yeah.
confused. Now I don't
Well,
even want
and
to build my sliver deck because now I'm
well,
worried
and
that I'm going to be
to be
playing too
honest,
many lands.
I know, right? You can't play too many lands. It's definitely an issue. But you also can't play too few. What you
Oh,
really need to
exactly.
know, and Owen, you kind of touched on this. You need to know what's the sweet spot. Where can your deck operate? Is that on 3 lands? Okay, then maybe
Right.
maybe you only need in a 60 card deck. Maybe you need, depending on how many cards you're going to see, how many cards are you going to draw, how many cards, like, do you have any spells that can fetch lands? Those kinds of things are really important to know. But assuming you don't have any of those, you're going to draw your regular allotment of cards. You want 3 on the battlefield. You might be able to go 20, between 21, 23 lands. Somewhere in there's probably where you want to be. Then you need to worry about how many colors you're juggling and then be able to make sure that you can fix properly. Um, but like I have a deck right now that's leveraging fight rigging. It's this Jund ramp thing that I'm trying to make work. It's not great so far, but we're working on it. And I lost a game earlier because I had 4 or 5 drops in my hand, and I'm stuck on 4 lands.
Mm.
Shuffler's rigged. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, Shuffler's not rigged. Yeah, there were 3 draws. Any one of them could have been a land, and I would have been fine. None of them were. These things
Well, there were.
happen. And I have,
Oh yeah,
but
it
in that
definitely
deck, I'm running, I
happens.
think, 27, 28 lands.
Jeez,
Yeah,
wow.
and I still didn't hit them, you
I
know?
was going to say that we
Yeah.
all know the incredible degree of complexity of this game, and this is not a
Mhm.
like pat yourself at the back moment. There was actually an independent researcher at the University of Pennsylvania back in 2019. His name was Alex Churchill, and he actually did a study about game mechanics, and he compared them to a variety of other games that are available, not just other TCGs, but other like board games and things like chess and stuff like that. And the result of their study, which was in partner with the Georgia Institute of Technology, was without a shadow of a doubt, Magic the Gathering is the most complex game, period, ever devised. As of about 2019, there was about 22 to 25,000 unique cards, depending on your qualification for what defines a unique card. And it was without a shadow of a doubt the most insanely complex gamer because there are so many opportunities for decisions that other games do not have. Every single time, even the concept of drawing a card is an option if you consider things like dredging and
Mhm.
necropotence and things like this game is beyond a level where I think I'm not sure if they've ever used AI to attempt to make a computer that's able to. Obviously, we have Sparky, but as we all know, she's taking the short bus to the WotC Center every day. But I'm never sure they're at an AI that's dedicated to actually making the correct choices based on board conditions, as opposed to just slamming cards or whatever. But the reason I mention that is things like you're talking about, like deck choices on the number of lands. There was another attempt, not from the same student at the University of Pennsylvania, where they tried to use an algorithm to try and define for certain if this is your average CMC, then these are the lands that you should have.
Mm.
But again, there's so many things there you could never possibly do. There's a number of cards, for example, in your definition of what your CMC is, that could be cards that have like miracle effect or have, the hideaway or, so many things that morph, for example, depending on how
Mm.
far back you're going, things that modify the cost of a spell, that even something like that, a simple calculation of average CMC versus number of lands, it breaks down. So
Mhm.
there is no simple answer really. And so for everyone, they're gonna have to, unfortunately, the real answer for a lot of this is trial and error, which is
Totally.
not this is not a great way to kind of answer something where people are looking for a definitive answer, but it's the reality of things sometimes.
It's kind of
Absolutely.
like
Well,
what you
then
like too,
modal
like
lands even showed up too to
Modal land, yeah, modal
make
lands
things even
too.
more complex. Yeah.
yeah, that's true actually. I think it's more like what you want to do. Like if once you get into the game and you play enough, you can already tell what you start to like. And then I think once you move into that direction, I think that's kind of like where we all end up. Like we just talked about our pet decks. I mean, essentially that's where we kind of just started. Yeah, we're still
Hmm.
here, kind of like doing the same thing to a certain degree. It's just updated 2022 version of it. And I mean that's still, everyone. I think a lot of players end up finding that, specifically ones that aren't just on the pro tour or just trying to grind GPs, quote unquote, all these other things where you end up playing a lot of the same decks over and over again. I think it's always kind of funny that we do end up like in the same place now, where it's like I like attack with my red creatures. Ham likes reanimating his spells, and OhOneNine's gonna make us discard all of our cards. It's kind of like where we're at, which is pretty funny. But in terms of deck building, we actually have specific archetypes that are
Sure.
revolved around deck building, and the 4 main ones are going to be aggro, tempo, control, combo, mid range.
Right.
We kind of have combined versions too, where you can say like tempo control
Hmm.
or aggro tempo or
Combo
combo
control.
aggro.
Hmm.
Yeah, combo control, mid range. You can play mid range aggro and you can play mid range control, which is really funny
Right.
because
Hmm.
that's one of the few archetypes that really gains a lot by adding and kind of like skewing one way or another more. And it's also like control mid range are two strategies that can evolve to what the metagame is doing, right? Like your aggro deck, even though, don't get me wrong, your aggro deck can still have some sideboard cards, or maybe even some main deck cards that help you grind, etc., etc. But mid-range decks and control decks essentially have all the best answers at their disposal. Usually, it's just about putting them into place and finding the correct numbers that can kind of help fit into what the
Right.
rest of the meta is looking like. Um, but essentially, I think a point that HamHocks and yourself, Owen, are talking about is curve. Mana curve is one of the most important things in a deck where
Mm-hmm.
we can say, okay, I'm supposed to be playing this many lands. That's fine. But then a lot of that also comes down to, well, maybe you should have enough plays early in the game to even finish the game so that
Right.
you don't even need to get to those late game plays. Those late game plays are when, you and your opponent are playing essentially like the same type of strategy of grinding the game out. And, you've lost almost all your resources and all of a sudden you hit, a China industry and you're like, oh, I'm glad that I run, two of this in my deck because I didn't
Right.
have it in my opening hand just sitting here. Now I top decked it, or, I drew it at the right time when I needed to play it. Um, things like that. I think mana
Mm-hmm.
curve is one of the most important things. And, mana curve for aggro, mana curve for mid range, control, combo, all these are different. Your combo decks, depending on what you're trying to do, if you're blue based, usually you're going to have a lot of dig, right? So you can kind of sacrifice maybe some more of your lands, and you're probably not really playing that many high drop cards unless they're like your finisher cards you're playing for free. Aggro is in the same vein to a certain degree where, depending on how high of a curve you have, maybe you want to play some Wandering Emperors, then maybe 24, 25 lands nowadays in an aggressive deck is actually acceptable. Whereas, 4 or 5 years ago, or the late 90s, you'd be like, oh, well, you just play 18 to 20 lands and you you smash face. But then, you also have to remember back then it was mostly ones and two drops, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Nowadays, we're really trying to hit our three drops on time. We've got multiples of them. We're really trying to hit our four drops on times. And, if we have five or sixes, even if they're a little bit discounted, we got to make sure that we hit them on time, or else, our opponent's just going to run all over us if they're doing their strategy better than we are. And I just think that, like, with uh, each archetype plays mana curve differently. Each archetype also has different ways to approach the other. And on top of that, you also have to remember to learn how to deal with yourself. And that's why I think, as when you're an early player in the game, obviously card acquisition plays a big role in it, but you're kind of like limited to like one or two decks, like you said, more like a pet deck. As you progress in Magic, you kind of start to gain a little bit more of your collection. And at least for me personally, I've always tried to skew my collection to be able to kind of play a lot more different strategies to actually learn them more, rather than
Right.
saying, oh, I'm just stuck playing red and burn, and oh, I hate blue. Blue sucks. I never want to play blue. Ugh. But it's like, well, I have become better at playing against those decks because I've taken the time to play those decks, whether it be playtesting, tournaments, arena nowadays. I learned a lot by playing those decks and being like, okay, well, oh, I'm playing against them. Well, I was in the same spot. Maybe they have this combination of cards, and maybe I have to figure out a way to puzzle to try to play against them, right? And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that plays like a really big role in terms of like how you're playing the game, and even overall how we're talking about deck building, because your sideboard plays a really, really big part, especially if you're playing best of three. If you're playing best of one, then you're just outright metagaming. You're building your
Mm-hmm.
deck to
Right.
essentially either stop what the best decks are in the format, or you're doing your
Right.
one strategy the best.
Right.
And if we're talking about best of three overall, all the archetypes in aggro and combo essentially are the two archetypes that want to be doing their one thing the best. They're willing to sacrifice some interaction, quote unquote, some counterplay, maybe even some card quality, just to be able to smash face and get them down to zero. Combos,
Mm-hmm.
just trying to get the combo going. It doesn't matter if you make me discard this one card, if I draw another copy, or if I have an extra one, or who cares? I still have Burgie out, and then I
Mm-hmm.
Right.
drew the Ignis, so now I can try to still go off. At least I pointed the game in the direction where I'm gonna
Sure.
combo. I pointed the game in the
Yes.
direction where I'm beating down. Whereas control and mid range and tempo definitely are more reactionary decks. So you also
Mm-hmm.
have to think about, in terms of deck building, you have to make sure that you have enough answers and that your answers line up correctly. How do you guys, what archetypes do you guys relate to, and how do you guys feel about deck building for, let's say, the broader sense of archetypes?
Ham, what do you think?
Um, well, when I'm looking at a deck, when I'm looking at, you know, if I'm setting out to build a particular archetype, like it's not uncommon. I personally gravitate more towards the aggressive side of things. Not usually full on aggro. I usually fall into more of the mid range camp. Um, because that's usually where your reanimator decks end up flying. Like I also love weird combos. I love finding ways to do odd things and trying to get them to fire. And most of the time, I want to put those into some kind of mid range shell. So that's usually where I end up, where I kind of rely. But at the end of the day, I do love just slamming 2 and 3 drops and turning them sideways. That does feel good. I'm not gonna lie. It is nice. And also, I feel like as a player, that style, like dealing with combat math, knowing when to attack, when to sit back, identifying who's the beatdown, threat analysis, that kind of thing. I feel like I'm okay at that. Like I feel like I'm decent at that. And when it comes to combat specifically, when I play control, when I try to play full on control, running a lot of board wipes, counter spells, trying to ramp up to a big threat at the end, I oftentimes struggle with understanding when to turn the corner, like
Mm,
when to try to be aggressive, when to hold back, how to use my resources appropriately. But at the same
Yeah,
time,
threat assessment I think is one of the
threat
most
assessment when
important
it comes
things
to
in control.
yeah, and when it comes to control, you're not doing combat math as often. That's
right.
not the primary objective. You're more worried about you're running through this huge Rolodex of what could be in their hand at
Right.
any given time, and how can I make sure my hand lines up to deal with it. Um,
Right.
that's intense. I mean, in an open decklist tournament scenario, yeah, you have the list, so that limits it dramatically. If you're on the ladder, especially if you're just doing best of one, there could be damn near anything coming out of that opponent's hand, and you got to be ready for. Like, that's hard. It is, and that's something that I struggle with. But so I generally lean towards the more mid-range angled, mid-range bent. And when I'm sitting down to build a deck, I think of it as kind of a spectrum. You have aggro and you have control, and then mid-range is kind of this sliding scale somewhere in between. And
Mm.
then tempo is kind of its own thing because it's like aggro control.
Yeah. Right.
You're
It's
kind of
like
doing both at the same time.
I'm gonna
It,
keep a steady pace of things coming out that you're gonna have to
mhm.
have equal responses to in time.
Yeah. Well, and dear listener, if you are out there and you aren't 100% sure on the difference between tempo and control,
Mm.
get familiar with those because they are very different decks.
Yeah. Right.
The they're both, in many cases, they're both running blue, so, and a lot of them are even running blue white. So if you just
It's
think
mostly
blue white,
white. Yeah.
yeah, blue white decks that run counter spells. Grr, I hate them
Right.
all, stupid control players or whatever.
Mono
If
blue
you find yourself
spirits
in
is
that
like a tempo
situation,
deck.
Yes. Yeah.
you like definitely do a little bit of research and practice. If you have access to the cards, if you're playing on digital or whatever the case may be,
Right.
try playing with the decks, because then you will see the chinks in the armor. You'll find the ways to beat them. But tempo is all about sticking an early threat, protecting it while disrupting your plan, and beating you to death with a little threat. Whereas
Right.
control is all about locking you out or preventing you from
Right.
enabling your game plan, and then enabling a big haymaker at the end of the day to
Right.
finish you off. Very different strategies. Very different strategies. And like you're saying, mid range, like both of you guys have been saying, mid range can do either. The goal of a good mid range deck is to have some of the best cards at every point on your mana curve that can either apply pressure or react at any given moment. Um, right now in standard, there is a mono black deck that's kind of the talk of the town. We're still only a week into the new standard, so
Sure.
I'm just going to use this as an example because some people call that mono black control. I've heard a lot of people refer to it as mono black control. Meanwhile, it has like a lot of different variations of it out there. Have like Tenacious Underdog, or I've even seen Shakedown Heavy in some lists. Like they have some big aggressive low drop creatures which you don't generally see in control decks. I think of that mono black deck that we're seeing right now as more of a mid-range deck because
Yep,
they
I'd
have a good
100%.
2 drop, good 3
I
drop,
think
good
it's
4 drop,
tempo.
good 5 drop. You
Right.
think it's tempo?
I
Okay.
think it's tempo mid range because, and I know we're kind of mincing words
Maybe
here,
we're
and
splitting hairs a little bit, but yeah.
yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, obviously it fits into the mid range because mid range to me is more of like a definition of not only playing through the middle of the game, the 3, 4, 5, 6 land drops, 3, 4, 5s, but Also, just a definition of like purely the CMC. That's another thing that we, not in addition to the strategy, sometimes the definition can also revolve strictly around the average cost of the cards you have. I mean, aggro is typically by definition is sub to CMC average. I think for a
Mm-hmm.
purist, someone who runs like modern red aggro, with like, spirit, or excuse me, with any of the cards that have haste and stuff like that, Goblin Spirit, Goblin Guide, and everything else that's in there. I think the reason that the mono black is so dominant right now, as of here we are in September 2022, mono
Mm-hmm.
black, the set has just come out, is because it is a tempo deck, because it has, like you said, it has Tenacious Underdog, it has cut down at 1 immediately. If they're
Yes.
on the draw, guess what? You're on the draw and you play your own turn 1 spell. If it's a ramp spell or just a minor threat or whatever, they can immediately turn 1 cut down. Turn 2, Tenacious Underdog, which is a 2 mana 3/2 with a hard upside to come back from the graveyard. Again, if you had shown this card to somebody from the mid 90s, it'd blow their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, then you have on turn 3, you have, whether you're the Rakdos or the mono black version, you either go Fable the Mirror Breaker, or you could go into the Trespasser, and you're immediately digging through their
Mm.
graveyard, and you have a permanent, which is a 3 mana 3/3, again with 2 hard upsides. Now it's protected with a ward effect, and it has the ability to, if you don't do something, it's going to eat through your graveyard and gain you life and drain you. And then immediately on 4, you've got Shield Dread, and then same thing. So I think it's a tempo effect in addition to being mid-range, because of the fact that it's a every single sequence as you're going along, you are presented with a new threat, and a diverse threat, because there's also you have Sorin, you have Liliana, and then at the very top end you have Invoke. So guess what? Now, even if you have managed, let's say you're in a neutral board state. Each of you has roughly the same number of lands. You both have 5 lands. The board is cleared, and your life totals are roughly the same. They immediately hit you with Invoke, because they're guaranteed to then, in addition to punishing you with life loss and you drawing cards. So it's tough to combat. We kind of were talking about how an Explorer Rakdos is kind of the de facto best deck. It's coming at you from 11 different angles, and to me, that's really just tempo mid range through and through. It's just so tough to beat, and I don't know that there's an answer. You can either try to go underneath, which right now red doesn't have enough cheap removal. I mean, we got was it
Mm-hmm.
Lightning Strike? It's
Yep.
I
Lightning Strike
mean,
was a good addition to the format, I think.
it's
Yeah.
good, but it's like it's not going to beat. I mean, that doesn't even touch Shield Red.
Nope.
Um, if you want to hit Trespass, you're going to have to discard a card. I mean,
Yeah, that ward on Trespasser is
Yeah, Trespasser's
savage.
pretty rough.
so going
Yeah.
underneath is not really an option. You could go over top with control, I guess. But the thing is, if they stick Shield Red, the majority of control decks rely on card advantage, which you're getting
Mm-hmm.
punished for every time you draw a card. Oof, I don't know.
It's
It's a
pretty
big.
rough. Yeah.
It's gonna be rough.
Yeah.
I think like um we're getting a little bit off topic, but I think mostly like a few more notes on black are that like from the tournaments that we've seen a lot more Fable the Mirror Breaker decks, just
Mm,
because that card does quite a lot. That card by itself is like
Mm-hmm.
4 or 5 cards, so I think that's where you're getting the black deck, is that you have to play more value than they are. So you have to play like a lot more comes into plays effects. You have to
right.
play a lot more cards that essentially replace themselves. Uh, you can't even just play straight. I draw more cards than you because of the reasons you said, like Shield Dread. Um, Liliana's here, so discarding cards is going to be rough. I mean,
Right.
if you're able to play some graveyard strategies, is good too, because if they're making discard your cards, then you don't even care that they're hitting the bin. So it really still comes down to you need to have the most value against that deck, because then their 1-for-1s that slowly turn into 2-for-1s
Right.
don't seem as powerful. Because in reality, a lot of all the cards nowadays are 2-for-1s.
Mm-hmm.
So it really has to do with like how you play them and how much efficiency you're getting out of the card. Which O1, as a limited player yourself, that one of the main things, at least for me in limited, is that I'm always trying to get the most I can out of my cards. If I can get the most that I can out of my cards, I have a higher chance of beating my opponent.
Yeah.
Making a trade, just to make a trade, or doing some other things, just because you think it's going to be fine isn't necessarily always the best thing to do. You want to make sure that you max out on that 2 mana 2/2 sometimes, because you can get some more cards out of your opponent's hand. You can get some other creatures that are in play. Maybe it's part of your strategy and you can keep that going. I just feel like that's just so important, and I think that the black deck does that so well, because every
Right.
card is trying to be up front. It's a 1-for-1, and then once you untap with whatever cards you have out, they start to turn into your 2-for-1s or more. So as long as you're counteracting that by doing the same thing essentially, which yeah, I think we could end up seeing like a blue deck, or maybe I think there's going to be some aggro decks out there that have some kind of card advantage, because green just is all over the place. I mean, green has so many good creatures, and it also still has some draws. So I think that green
Yeah.
has a chance to be there. I mean, blue, we haven't seen any blue decks yet. Rafine is always a ridiculous card.
Yeah.
Um,
You know what else
there's
is
chances.
another thing that might happen is if, like you mentioned with just like green, is if we can, it's just if you are going to run a creature based deck, you just need to have some way of protecting it, because right now black has just so many outrageous means of beating it. And the problem is you can't go wide, because your answer might be, okay, well, Tenacious Underdog, Shield Dread, who cares? They're one ofs. Trespasser. I'm just going to go big wide with Selesnya tokens, which is a very common archetype going all the way back to the beginning of Magic's history. Or I'm going to do Boros, aggro, stuff like that. The problem is they also forgot about Meat Hook, which is still in the format and is still just an absurd card. Um, is actually one of the few cards that we've been talking about that doesn't see play outside of Standard or Explorer. It is not a card that it sees play in Modern or any of the other Eternal formats or anything. Even Pioneer doesn't see any play, much play at all. But for us, when we're trying to defeat this one opponent, it's like, so if you try and go tall and protect, things like a boon of safety, if you're trying to play any splash of white, which gives like shield counters, which was a fun thing. I really did like that addition from New Capenna. I think shield counters, for one, I don't know if you guys played much draft, but that nasty Bant 2/1 double striker that came into play with a shield counter, that thing was a game wrecker on turn 3. So maybe something like a boon of safety, which is a 1-cost instant speed spell, 1 white that gives a shield counter, and you get to scry 1, where you could, in response to them trying to target removal something. There's some lines there, because I think mono green might have a chance, but they have to find a way to protect their big creatures. I mean, Defiler is only so good if it's immediately nuked by a 2-cost removal spell.
We still have
actually,
Tamio
you
safekeeping, because Tamio's only costs a couple
True.
life.
Yeah,
And you gain the life back by protecting it.
well,
Which
and
is
those
kind of
cards are
funny.
great. Those cards are awesome, except the problem with the current black removal suite is those don't help you against Liliana or Invoke Despair.
Because of sacrifice. Yeah,
Because of
sacrifice
sacrifice.
is such
And Meat Hook
huge.
Massacre is toughness reduction, so giving something a shield counter indestructible doesn't help against that either. So yeah, it helps against your Infernal Grasps, sure.
Right.
Cut
And your
downs.
Which is a very popular card, so I'm not
Right.
trying to discount that. Like, that's real, but
Right.
yeah. Or in combat, of course, with, all the bodies that they've got on board. But at the
That's why
same time,
Control, man. Control's going to be the deck that beats it, because you can
Has to
just play a
be.
it's gotta
Planeswalker,
be, right?
and then
Maybe
you could
Team
board
War.
white back as many times as you can, and then their Meat Hook doesn't matter. So then you're sitting
Right.
there with like a Teferi or something upticking and drawing your
Right.
cards, doing your thing, and then you don't even care, because that's the only way you can really mitigate Liliana and Shield Dread, right? Because Liliana attacks the hand so efficiently at 3 mana, and Shield Dread punishes you for essentially playing your strategy and or trying to dig for an answer. But let's not forget, some of the best ways to dig in blue don't even care about drawing cards. Impulse literally says, look at your top 4, put it in your hand. Memory Deluge, look at your
put it
top
in your
X,
hand.
put it into your hand. So they kind of get around Shield Dread in a certain, in a good way. And I think that Control eventually finds a way to have the best answers and then find the quickest end game. Like Jeskai Hinata was the best example of that, where for a while, I mean, there was a good 3 or 4 weeks where everyone was wondering if Jeskai Hinata was a meme. And there were some of us that were like, yeah, we got to do it a couple times in the game and it was fun. And then look at the end of Standard. It was just Hinata. Right?
Yeah,
Hinata was
it
the
was
best
the
deck.
Yeah.
And
Green
Boros.
Green beat it. Green was the most played and had the higher win percentage because it beat Hinata. The same thing that happened with Allred's Epiphany metagame, where mono white and green could get under the deck and crush it before it could start to take turns. and you can crush Hinata before it does the thing because your cards are all like 5/5s. Um, so I don't
Right.
know. I think Control probably has the best chance of beating at least the black deck at the end of the day because it just ends up playing. It could just play a Planeswalker with counter spells, and then
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter if the black deck has like it doesn't even have Bloodchief's Thirst anymore. It plays the Soul Transfer, I think is what it's called. Excuse me.
Right.
If
Right.
I'm wrong on that, you play a couple of those at sorcery speed. I mean, blue doesn't care. They just laugh at you and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, cool! You spent 3 mana. I counter it and draw some
Well,
cards and untap and play a land and say go again."
yeah. One comment I would like to make as it relates to the Jeskai Hinata deck specifically. We kind of got on this little tangent because I mean, obviously this is on the top of all of our minds right now, which is understandable, I think. But when it comes to deck building, kind of as a little note to kind of bring it back a little bit, be aware you have to be aware of the metagame. And one example of that is the decks that were successful against Hinata most often ran Valorous Stance, which is
Right.
a
Right.
perfectly fine utility uncommon. However, in a meta, so it's a spell. It's an instant for 1 and a white. Target creature gains indestructible tail end of turn. Okay, one of those protection spells. Costs 2 instead of 1, so not great. But the mode that really allowed it to sing was destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater. This hit Hinata, and it also hit Goldspan Dragon,
Yes.
which were
Yes.
the two big threats in that meta. So
Right.
as a result, this little 10-cent uncommon that's perfectly fine became an all-star piece of removal, especially coming out of sideboards with usually 1 or 2 copies in the main because of how common that matchup was. And it has some flexibility too, so you can save your thing if need be. So it's never really dead. But at the end of the day, I just wanted to throw that out there because you mentioned, yeah, Hinata was everywhere. And so as a result, a card that could specifically target Hinata was relevant all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of sideboards, I mean, you're bringing up a good point about a topic that we should just discuss right now, and that's actually sideboarding against tier decks that we already know. I
mm,
think that a lot of like what we talked about has to do with the super competitive side of it, and then the brewing side of it, right? Because that's kind of like where deck building ends up being in between, right? It's both of those. Um, Specifically, when you're playing a homebrew, a pet deck, I think that it ends up being a little bit. It's still hard to beat the matchups, but it ends up being a little bit easier to find some answers against the more known decks because sometimes those answers already exist, like Ray of Enfeeblement for Hinata was.
mm-hmm,
Where, if you're playing against Hinata and you're playing black, I mean, you better be playing Ray of Enfeeblement, right? Not only does it hit Hinata, well, it also hits the white weenie decks.
Right.
And then what if they're
Or
playing
the
some other?
angels.
Yeah, hit some angels, hit some other. There's other random decks that get hit by it. And I
mm-hmm,
actually think, for me personally, I think that that's nowadays cyborgs have become what modern cyborg was, and still is. Where modern people have complained, used to complain. I don't know if they probably still do, but back in my day when we played modern, everyone wanted 20-card sideboards because a
mm,
lot of people felt like
Mm,
15 cards wasn't enough because there's some matchups that you almost had to play 4 of just to beat it, and so on and so forth. But then that also comes down to magic. I mean, that
mm-hmm.
I don't think we should be playing more
right.
cyborg cards because of that. It just has to do with that's just the meta. That's how some decks, that's how
20,
some decks
20
work.
cards? You should be able to swap your deck out
Yeah, yeah, that's
mid game
just
one
Yeah,
to
I don't
two.
know.
Anyway,
That's
that's yeah.
some
but
people
Okay.
would say 15 is too many.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think 15 is the sweet spot, but yeah. Yeah.
but I think like it becomes a little bit easier when you already know what to beat. But you also have to remember that just because you think that you have a good matchup against it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be bringing in these cyber cards or you shouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
playing these cyber cards, because I think that there's a lot of like a misconception of thinking, oh, this is a good matchup, I don't really need to play any extra cards for it. Well, unfortunately, I mean, if you're not bringing any cards in and your opponent's bringing in like 5 or 6, I mean, you're at a high disadvantage there because their deck's going
Mm-hmm.
to be a
Yeah.
lot more tuned to beat yours, even if you could, quote unquote, beat them game one a lot easier. You're right, because they're turning 60-40 into you know 55-45 or whatever. essentially kind of like making it a little bit more fair. And then, you end up getting a stumble and then you lose because you didn't bring in your sideboard cards, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that uh, my main thing, at least with the 20 cards things, is that in modern Magic, you kind of have to have some cards in your sideboard that deal with everything. You can't just be like, okay, they're playing a graveyard deck. I just play, my Tormod's Crypt was like a good example. I just play my Tormod's Crypt,
Right.
and then that's it. It's like, well, Tormod's Crypt, it's fine, but it probably wouldn't really do anything. Hearse is better, right? Because
Yeah.
Hearse, you play it,
Right.
it gets rid of the graveyard. It can be a creature later. You can even just play
Right.
Hearse and not even have an opponent that's playing a graveyard based strategy. Cards go
Mm-hmm.
to the graveyard, it's just a Tarmogoyf. It's a sorcery
Right.
speed Tarmogoyf, right? Is what it
Right.
ends up becoming. But that card is a great example of it has enough flexibility that in the matchups you want it for, it's phenomenal. And then there's other matchups you can just bring it in as an extra card that's just good value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's kind of like where modern Magic and modern sideboarding is for all of, let's say, like the tiers, right? Because you want to have something that deals with the best decks, but then you also want to have something that deals with the decks that are lower or your worser matchups.
Yeah, and what do you think? What's your I would say well, I'll leave it to you here. What's your primary approach to sideboarding when you do construct a best of 3?
I don't play enough best of 3. I always enjoy it when I play it, and then I don't, and then I just play best of 1. I don't know why. That's something I need to change that. That's just a bad habit on my part. Um, but best of 1's easy. I like the hand smoother, and I don't have to worry about sideboard slots. And when you're brewing as many decks as I have, I brew at least a deck a day, pretty much at this point. Most of which are garbage, by the way. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. But we're trying stuff, right? Um, but every now and then you hit one, and it's great. But brewing 60 is a lot easier than brewing 75. So
Hmm.
there's that. But when I do really sit down to build a sideboard, my main focus is what is the meta, and especially what are my bad matchups. But like you're saying, Pizza, you made a great point. Where even in your favorable matchups, you should probably still have something you can do with your sideboard. I've had plenty of games where I go to my sideboard and like, okay, I should probably be able to do this, and then I look at my sideboard and realize I don't have anything in my sideboard that can do this, so I guess I'm just gonna run it back and hope for the best. And I know, like as a deck builder, like okay, that was a problem. I need to tune up my sideboard. So when you're doing your deck builds, when you are playing your decks, be aware of that. If you find yourself just clicking that continue button, if you're playing on Arena, for example, to just go on to games 2 and 3 without adding anything to the sideboard, your sideboard could probably get tuned to whatever you're going up against. Yeah, so I usually try to focus on what is the meta and then identify what can answer the meta. So we do have obvious options. You have Tormod's Crypt, you have Unlicensed Hearse. Like, obviously, if my opponent is leveraging the graveyard, these hate on the graveyard. Hearse can do it at instant speed, which is pretty fantastic, as can Tormod's Crypt. Grafdigger's Cage is just a blanket, hate on it, except Greasefang, but
Right.
whatever.
Right.
But there's a lot of things like that, which are, okay, fine. Like, those style of hosers can be good, but I also want to be more creative in trying to find answers that fit my style. One thing that I had in a number of my kind of mid-range decks that were running white back in the day, one sideboard piece that is unfortunately rotated out of standard, but I found very helpful. Like, I had a number of warrior decks. Like, I tried to do warrior equipment style decks
The
in
Wizard tried to make that a thing for a while, didn't they?
yeah, they did. They were pushing it, especially in like alchemy. I've done it in Explorer and Historic, and one sideboard card that I use a lot in those style of decks is Sigrid the God Favored.
Sure, yeah, flashes in.
Yes, exactly. It's one of those cards that it's not great for that archetype necessarily because I'm trying to stick low cost threats and then like stable big hammers to them. Right, that's obviously what I'm trying to do. Um, so that's my plan A. However, if my opponent is also aggressive, once I have 3 mana up, I can hold this card back
Right.
and then flash it in, eat one of their attackers just by exiling it, and then block another one and kill it potentially. So in the right matchup, that becomes this little judo flip that I can put on my opponent. And the reason that I put it in the warrior equipment deck specifically is because Sigrid's creature type is warrior. So
Mm,
on the follow up, my resolute strikes, everything that I'm doing for my strategy synergizes with her once she's on the battlefield. So that's an example of a card that fits in a certain matchup within a certain deck. That's what I want to find in my sideboards. So that's what I'm looking for. If I'm specifically worried about like my opponent, one example that I think is going to be a key sideboard card that just came out in Dominaria is Karn's Silex. I think that is going
That
to be
card's great.
that thing's a really solid card, and I think any deck that's running artifacts, you may even want one in the freaking main. We don't really have a good artifacts deck yet, but when that comes, like I think it's going to be a piece. But if you're worried about Tenacious Underdog, Karn Silex shuts it off. It's great. It's locked in the graveyard because they can't pay the life to bring it out. So that's an example of a 3-mana artifact that can shut that card down if that's something that you're worried about. If they have any other effects that pay life, of which there are a couple out there, that shuts that down. And if you're running a deck that does not have a lot of small creatures or small permanents on the battlefield, then all of a sudden the additional ability that has of being effectively this like ratchet bomb-ish board wipe is pretty fantastic. So that's an example of a sideboard card that can fit a certain strategy very, very well. So be aware of what's out there in the meta. What are you going to go up against? And then also, what is your deck doing? And if you can find overlap, if you can find those tools that synergize with your plan while hosing somebody, those are the sweet spots. And those are the ones that you're going to want to lean into.
One thing I wanted to talk about is specifically for the 15 cards. So we talk about, for those who play in any competitive format, they talk about the 75, and they have to kind of reduce what they want, which is probably somewhere closer to about 100 cards, down to 75. There's the decision about the number of, there's the math that goes into your decision making on the number of how many opposition cards. So if you run up against an opponent, for example, who is an affinity deck, doesn't matter the format, we'll say modern, for example,
Artifact based
so they
deck
have,
for anybody that doesn't know
if they're
what
if
affinity
if they're an artifact affinity deck, whether it be Azorius or just mono blue, it doesn't matter. You have to make a decision at some point about what's the likely. You have to look at the game. This kind of wraps the whole. This kind of brings all of it back together now. So talking about addressing the metagame, assessing the state of the format that you enjoy playing, whatever that may be, and then determining what's the likelihood of me seeing affinity in modern. Probably medium. So it's there's a bunch of like 4-color piles that are pretty dominating things right now. Of course, there's Hammer Time, there's Control, Azorius Control, there's a bunch of us at mono red. Of course, red deck wins is always there. Affinity may be the 7th most popular deck, so maybe 4% of the time, 6% of the time you may see affinity. So then you look at the 15 cards you have in your sideboard, and you have to say to yourself, okay, is it realistic for me to put a one of in the sideboard, or do I just, there's a concept in the corporate world of like the lost cost fallacy, where you have to, sunken cost fallacy, where you've already lost a certain amount of investment on a particular thing that you're pursuing. Do I continue to go forward with that with the possibility of losing even more? So, for example, with affinity, do you run just a one of a card that says destroy all artifacts, or is it worth it to just take your thumps, take your lumps, whatever the phrase is, take your beats on losing against affinity because you don't have dedicated removal or dedicated hate, and instead look at the remainder of the metagame and just have cards that address those. And then if you do come up against a bad matchup against affinity and you don't have any way of clearing the board against artifacts, you just take your loss, you move on, you say, okay, you know what, we knew we were going to take a loss here, but in the overall, as I'm attempting to, if it's a 5-game tournament on MTG Online, or if it's in you're trying to climb the ladder in MTG Arena, or if it's in paper and you're actually just trying to go top 8 in whatever you're playing, do you just assess that and say, okay, is a one of worth it? Is a two of worth it? Or should I just say, you know what, I'm just going to lose against this deck, and that's okay, because the likelihood of me even facing them is very low. And pizza, I think it's actually very relevant to the tournaments that you host, because we've seen a number of people who have made it to the top 4 and even winning tournaments. Like, how in the world did they get there? They may have just fortuitously dodged all of their opponents that would have absolutely beaten them. There's a number of aggro decks. I think Gruul aggro. No, I'm sorry. Gruul aggro made it to the top last week, didn't they? Just a couple days ago.
It was in the finals. Yeah, it was in the finals
Yeah.
against Mardu Midrange, and I think they still took him to 3 games. So I mean, the girl deck was still, it's Magic. I to touch on what you talked about real quick. It really did tie what me and Ham were talking about because you're right. What sideboarding specifically, what it ends up being is that how bad is my bad matchup? Why am I
Right.
even
Mhm.
wasting
Right,
2
right.
cards
Yes.
that I might not
Right.
even see
Right.
when I may as well put in some cards that help me in this other matchup that even if it's a good matchup, at least I know having these 2 extra cards is going to help me go a lot more over the top.
Right. Right. Right.
And the
Mhm.
Grohl deck is kind of funny because it does play a little bit into the fact of what matchups you're going to see. Like, who knows? Maybe some of those cards in that deck's sideboard are probably too narrow.
Right.
And maybe they just didn't even see those, the matchups that mattered.
Mhm.
Maybe they just ran people over, played a couple extra protection spells here and there, maybe brought in some extra burn spells. Because a lot of the time, like, we end up overthinking the game and we end up making bad decisions on overthinking the game where we over sideboard or we're like, oh, I think I'm just going to play this because maybe it gives me a better chance or, quote unquote, this seems like it's a better option. But in reality, I think that most of the time you kind of, at least lately, I've been toying a lot more with the idea of sideboarding slim, where you say,
Mhm.
okay, yeah, okay, I won game 1. Okay, yeah, let's say that 7 or 8 of these cards in my sideboard are good again in the matchup, but realistically, I don't really want to water down my strategy that much.
Sure.
Maybe
Right.
I can bring in
Mhm.
half of those cards, 4 to 5 of those cards, knowing that they're going to help give me an edge. Maybe I saw how my opponent played. Maybe I know the type of deck list that they're playing. Maybe a couple cards hinted at that. So I don't necessarily have to bring in all 8 of these cards because sometimes you're like, all right, yeah, this extra removal spell is good, but then you read the removal spell and it's like, well, that removal spell is actually maybe a little bit too situational. I don't want to be stuck with that removal spell in my hand and then it doesn't line up against the rest of their cards. So then now I'm sitting
Mhm.
here, with a card that kills these 2/2s and 1/1s, and then my opponent's playing 3/3s, 4/4s, and higher mana cost cards, and you're losing because you were like, well, I wanted to bring in these 2 extra cards because they might have helped. I think that sideboard and slim and kind of like picking your poison and thinking about what your better matchups are and diagnosing that with like gameplay and kind of like you yourself being like a deck doctor and kind of like playing these games out and seeing how your deck functions and what strategy you want to do. I think that all that plays like a really big role in you making your sideboard decisions because you're right, 15 cards, I mean, that's a quarter of your deck.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So a quarter of your deck, I mean, yeah, a lot of the time you're not, if you're bringing in 10 cards, it's probably a problem.
Sure.
Right, because you're
Yeah.
watering your deck down and then you're also bringing in, like I said, maybe like some cards that are almost too situational, and then you're like,
Mhm.
what ends up happening is that you bring in like the 8 cards. Let's say you actually do bring in the 8 cards. What ends up happening is you have these answers and they're not lining up, and
Mhm.
you're like, well, this sucks. I mean, I have the right cyborg cards, quote unquote, right? I mean, it says destroy target green creature, but or Noxious Grasp is the best example where Noxious Grasp is destroy a
Right.
green or white creature
Creature
or
or planeswalker.
planeswalker.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But
Destroy
you're
target Oko. Yes.
yep. Yeah, you're like, oh, this seems great against certain strategies. Like let's say you're trying to play that against specific mid-range decks. Let's say you're up against Mardu or you're up against Jund. And you're like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
oh, well,
Nissa decks. Oh
yeah,
god.
where
I
Yep.
always
I
bring that up
saw a
against
couple of
Uh-huh.
Nissa.
Nissas, but they also played Graveyard Trespassers and Kalidas. So I
Right.
don't want to
Mhm.
be
Right.
stuck with the Noxious Graph sitting here like,
True.
oh, I hope that they play this 5 drop. It's like, it's not really
Right.
like a realistic way to look at it. I just think that you have to really, it really touches a lot on like what O1 said, which is Magic isn't just cut and dry. Like a lot of it's so situational. Like even you can even take some of the best professional players' advice on how to sideboard, what to do in certain matchups, but then like sometimes there's certain key situations that you yourself are gonna get into that you're not gonna know, and you kind of have to make like a gut decision on, and kind of like take your licks, take your hits how you want to take them
Yeah.
because
What did I
and
say?
learn from there.
Take your thumbs. I didn't even know. I didn't know this. I think it's
Yeah,
take
take
your
your thumb.
lumps.
Yeah, take your
Is
Lumps, I
lumps.
think, is
The
the expression. Yeah.
it's actually the saying.
because that's how you
Yeah.
learn. I mean, you're right. Like there's
Mhm.
I think that people it ends up making players lazy because you end up feeling like, oh, it's just a bad matchup. I don't really care about it. Well, you should still play it because okay, yeah, affinity is like, oh, they went Ornithopter into Gingerbread Man.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
cool, but what if all they do next turn is they play like the Mana Rock and then they just attack for one
Mm-hmm.
again,
Right.
and you're like, oh, that fast start actually sucked because they kept a really good turn one, but then now the rest of their plays are kind of shitty, and
Mm-hmm.
I think I can beat that. You know what I mean? And then you're
Yeah.
like, oh, this seemed like a
Sure.
bad matchup, but they're,
I
obviously
mean,
like it goes back to, oh, you're just playing Magic. You got to play Magic. You have to
yeah.
play the
Mm-hmm.
game
I mean,
out.
we have by force. We don't have meltdown, but we do have by force, which is now available, has been available in Explorer and as it Explorer and Historic, but Destroy X artifacts. So I mean, that was the card I was
Ooh.
kind of fumbling to try and remember the name of. By the way, I was trying to use the example of either meltdown or by force as a how many of these do you bring? If affinity is X percentage, do you bring one or do you bring zero and just say, you know what, if
Well,
I face it, I lose. It's fine.
so specifically
Yeah.
in older formats, you run into situations where you can play a lot of graveyard and artifact enchantment hate knowing that that's around so much. Like
Right.
Mm-hmm.
specifically, you can get away with more naturalized effects nowadays because of Fable. Whereas
Right.
before, you'd be a
Absolutely.
little bit silly because you'd be like, why are you main decking Break Asunder is the best example. Be like, why are you
Oh.
main decking Break Asunder? Because
Came
Break
out of
Asunder,
nowhere.
it doesn't hit everything. It doesn't kill a creature. It's like, well, what if they're playing some Kamigawa cards where their cards are enchantment creatures?
Mm-hmm.
What if they are playing Reckoner Bankbuster? Well, now I can
Mm-hmm.
just get rid of that. My opponent's not drawing cards. And then later in the game, my Break Asunder can still kill the planeswalkers it needs to kill.
Right. Well, and you're exactly right because right now, if you're in standard, like yeah, Terra Sunder is fantastic because yeah, it's just 2 mana, destroy targeting artifact or enchantment.
Exile, I think, right?
Exile, yeah,
Oh, it is
exile.
exile.
Yep,
You're right.
yep,
You're right.
exile.
Even better.
Like 50% at least of decks are running Fable the Mirror Breaker. Like if your opponent has red mana, that card is in there, and the ones that don't have Bankbuster, like you're saying. So yeah, like
Yeah, there's
straight
other
up,
cards
you
they
could
play.
run natural. Like in this meta, I do believe you could main deck disenchant style effects. Like Terra Sunder has that kicker that can hit any non-land permanent, which makes it like really takes it over the top. But I personally think that like, even just a straight disenchant style effect in the current standard would
Oh, it's
still hit plenty
fantastic.
of targets.
Well, you're on the
Like it would
draw
still hit
against like
plenty.
a wedding announcement. Like they
Mm-hmm.
don't even get the token. You can just
That'd be
exile it before you
amazing.
even get to end step. You
True.
you get rid of the enchantment outright. You just time walk your opponent, and then now you
Yeah.
play your Fable. And then in that instance alone, you have literally flipped the game in your favor.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right? You went from being like, oh crap, now there's this card that gives them permanence on the battlefield and has the potential to draw them cards. Instead, you're like, I'll just exile that. You get nothing on my turn. I'll play my value card that does three things. And then now you have to deal with that. And if you can't, let's say you can only kill half of it. Let's say you do get to kill the Fable. I still have a 2/2 that's generating
Mm-hmm.
mana. Let's say you kill the 2/2. The next turn, I'm filtering my hand, maybe digging for some better cards, and then
Well, I
eventually
mean,
getting a card that is a finisher in most decks.
you look at Reclamation Sage and you say to yourself, this is a fine card, but
Mm-hmm.
why in the world? But it still to this day sees sideboarding in some, not just elves, but in some modern decks because yeah, that naturalized effect on ETB plus having, albeit just a 2/1 body, is it's enough. I
Mm-hmm.
guess it's enough. If you have
It can
white,
do
you
the
can
job.
also
Yeah.
if you have white, you can also get that Minotaur lady. I forget her name, but she does similar effect. But you could also gain 4 life or make her
Yeah, it's
a three
it's a
a three
dryad. I forget what it does, but yeah, it's the green white one, right? It's green white and a
similar effect.
colorless.
Cost 3, yeah.
2/1 and yeah, two counters, and that card's great because that's like the ultimate Rex Sage, which is
Oh,
funny
it's
because it's kind of like to where Magic is now, where those cards don't even get played as much as they used to, and that card, the one I'm sorry that it's slipping our mind right now, folks,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
that Celestia card specifically has three modes. And the three of us know the more options in Magic the Gathering, the better. Like if your card isn't doing
Right.
two or three things, or you have the option to put some mana into it, then it's
Knight
not
of
really
Autumn.
worth it.
Knight of the Autumn.
Yeah, Knight
Yep.
of
Knight of the
Autumn.
Autumn.
Yep,
Okay.
yep, yep,
So
yep.
the other thing I was going to say about that card is in diversity of sideboarding is it also is an incredible card against red deck wins because
Yep.
it's a 3 mana 2/1 ETB gain 4 life. So if your win condition is a ways away, let's say it's 4 or 5 mana, and you just have a body on board that can block a swift spear and then gain you 4 life. Oh my god, that might give you a turn or two closer to not dying immediately to particularly things like red.
Absolutely.
You blow up the
Well,
Embercleave.
yeah.
That's a
Well,
big
Yeah,
one
and
that too.
too.
absolutely. Well, it's something, to my point earlier about, we're talking about reclamation stage style effects. Mono white has a rec sage in standard right now that a lot of people are not running
Hmm.
in Cathar Commando.
Card's
It's a
great.
Oh
free.
yeah,
Card is
sure, sure,
fantastic. It's
sure.
a really good
It's
card.
excellent, and
Yep.
that is a great potential sideboard piece. Again, if you're running a deck that cares about creatures, like
Yeah,
if you're running a Selesnya creature based deck, that could just slot right in, and
sure.
it could be main deck because of the worst case scenario. You have a 3/1 human with
Flash,
flash.
Flash. I mean, at the end of their phase, I mean, God, I mean,
Was not
with
to
all the
love, and then you can pay one,
yeah,
sack it, and then blow up an artifact or
It
enchantment.
trades
So
up. It could
even
trade with a
and
trespasser.
it can trade up exactly.
It blows up
It
a
can get it for a
fable.
block, blow something up, or trade with the trespasser for 2 mana. I mean, like when you're thinking about your sideboard or when you're thinking about teching against the meta, think about all those little interactions. Try to find all those little pieces, and that's another great one that, especially also with extraction specialist, like and Sarah
oh
Paragon, you
yeah,
can
that's
recur that
true.
out of your graveyard all day. Like, well, not all day, but a lot. It's pretty good. So I just keep that in mind. Depending on what strategy you are doing, those style effects can be really valuable.
So yeah, I think that like a lot of what you're touching on, Ham, specifically is something that is one of our main topics here on the podcast tonight, which is trending patterns in the meta. So specifically, even with sideboarding, you kind of want to follow along with what's current in the format that you're playing in. Just because your deck did phenomenal 2 days ago and you went like 10-3 or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that your sideboard or even the main deck needs some help, because we all know that just because your deck is doing good today, tomorrow a million games have been played or something.
Mm-hmm.
So now everything can be different. I mean, overnight we've seen the metagame just change, right? Where all of a
Sure.
sudden one day we're like, oh yeah, Runes is the best deck, and then you wake up and you're like, whoa, oh, Hinata's good now. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's a thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
keeping your finger on the pulse is something that kind of all the things we've been talking about are really impactful. It's really up to the player if they want to kind of follow the herd and choose to not. And again, this is not a slight in any way to folks who choose to recognize what the best archetype is and then copy it. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you it's like it's like the old head coach for the Jets. You play to win the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's very obviously what all of many of our goals are. Some folks just enjoy playing the game and brewing and all those things, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with recognizing the predominant archetype and just either copying it or modifying it or just taking it straight up. So yeah, I think recognizing what's out there and then choosing to either be the anti-meta player and combating it face to face, or just adopting it and maybe making your small adjustments to it. Um, both are completely valid approaches to playing the game.
Absolutely. But
100%.
if you are going to adopt that style, which is, yeah, again, totally fine. I cannot echo that loudly enough. I know there's some folks out there who talk about how net decking is like ruining the game. It's overblown. Don't listen to them. No, it's totally fine. The one thing that I would then really I would encourage you to focus on is learning how to play the deck, because Magic, we were talking about this earlier. Magic is an incredibly complicated game. There's a lot of stuff. There are decision points everywhere. From
Hmm.
before you start play, you have the decision of whether or not to keep your opening 7. Like, it begins there. That's one of the most critical decisions you can make, by the way. But
Yeah,
even then,
mulligan decisions are huge.
mulligans are huge.
Yeah,
But at the end of the day, you need to know how to run the deck. You can't just look at whatever the pros are running, copy, paste, log into Arena, and just assume you're going to get to Mythic if you play enough games. Like, you need to learn. You need to understand how the deck functions. You need to, and don't get me wrong, playing with it is the best way to do that. But go into those games with an open mind and try to understand what's working, what's not. At the very least, also just take a minute to look at the cards and really try to break down what the deck's trying to do, how it's going to fire, and if like try to find those little synergies and try to be aware of those before you step into the game. You will discover some in the process. Like I think we've all had that moment where you realize, like, wait a minute, this combo's awesome.
Yeah.
Change your
Those
basics at least. Put some sleeves on your deck. Don't just
yeah.
import and run. Is what Ham is saying. Don't import and
I mean,
run.
yeah, exactly.
If
Put
you
the
change
sleeves
your
on it,
basics,
I
maybe
guess.
you'll look at something that you wouldn't have looked at otherwise.
Flavor it up.
Actually, that's one of the things I love when I log into a game and I see somebody throw a basic land and it was like the default from like 3 or 4 sets ago. I'm like, oh, they've been playing this deck for a while.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
they recently downloaded it. It's hard to say. It's so funny. As a brief aside, I don't mean to interrupt you all, but I wanted to say the one thing with, despite all of the major issues we actually have with the client and MTG Arena, wouldn't it be nice to have preferred default lands
Oh my
that we
goodness,
don't have
yes.
to? Because I have mine. I know you all have yours. And whether they be the John Avons or not, John Avon is the correct choice. You
I mean,
should
yeah.
being able to select anyway. Yeah, I see what you're saying though. It is so funny though. And then also we're talking about recognizing the meta. You can also recognize the meta and the type of player who may be the type that, you know, like you said, download a deck or something like that, and they don't particularly care because they're here to grind the ladder. And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We all are here playing this game for different reasons. There are people who buy and collect magic cards who have never played a lick of magic, who just enjoy the artwork and enjoy the idea of like collecting and trading and stuff like that. So everyone is absolutely due their ability to choose how to enjoy the game as they choose.
Oh yeah,
That's very true.
100%.
Well, and heck, even the universes beyond secret layers, you know, all that stuff that Wizards is doing. Like, do you think they did a Street Fighter secret layer so that hardcore tournament players could sit
Right,
down with
right.
Chun-Li? No, they did it so that the kid who's, you know, trained to become a Street Fighter champ, you know, like wants to be a professional Street Fighter player. I'm assuming that's still a thing. That's how far
Yeah,
out of touch with that whole world I am.
yeah. FGC is still a
Yeah,
thing.
but the people who are following fighting games now have this cool collectible that they can have. They're like, hey, they can have a little sleeve or put it on a frame or whatever, and just have a nice little thing that commemorates their favorite character in their favorite game.
Yeah,
You know,
I have
that's
a
what it's
real
for.
life example of that. Ham, I have a friend who has never played a lick of Magic in their life,
Mm-hmm.
and they're a huge fan of The Walking Dead. And this is a very controversial thing because one, it was one of the first among
Mm-hmm.
the first handful uh, of secret lair. Now we have so many now. We have
Oh yeah,
two, three
nowadays it's
dozen of them.
whatever. But
But this is
yeah.
what among the first ones, and the big deal then. And we won't get into. I don't think we have enough time today. I think we're already up against time. But one of the big things with that one, of course, was because of how much it altered Commander and the way that it
Mm-hmm.
influenced the game. Again, a topic for another day.
Yeah, the
But
first mechanically unique ones were the Walking Dead ones. Yeah, yeah,
first
Yeah.
mechanically unique, yeah, not the
Mm-hmm.
Ikoria ones, which were just cosmetic.
Yep.
And he's never played Magic in his life, but he's like, I love Walking Dead and I love all the Carl, he loves all the memes and everything. And so he's just like, yeah, I'm gonna buy this thing. It's $30 and it's a thing I can put on my shelf alongside my other figurines of all the characters from the show I like. So yeah, uh, man, what a brilliant
Players
move.
forget that people collect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
It's
players,
a collectible
we
card
all
game.
get
That's
so
kind of
Yeah.
caught
the
up
point.
in being
Yeah.
like, I gotta play my cards, I gotta play this deck, I gotta play a tournament, I gotta get out, I gotta play, right? But you know, we all forget. I mean, this kind of like plays a little bit what we talked about the first time we had O1 on, which is like burnout of the game. I think that like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of you getting some of that off of your back is you finding enjoyment in Magic in the other aspects of it, right? And the collecting and kind of like this actually ties into deck building. It's like, what do you like to do in Magic? Well, then maybe you should try to get into it a little bit more and enjoy that aspect of it. Oh, you like to play goblins? Well, why don't you just get into like some goblin clans, or maybe you like to learn a little bit more about Groll and really be like, oh, I enjoy Groll because of this reason. And I think that that's always like really important and really helps you like define yourself in the game,
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
because you just get you know, you kind of get a little bit burnt out on playing the same meta, playing tournaments over and over again, that you actually kind of end up losing feeling for
Mm-hmm.
what you're trying to do. essentially,
Sure.
Sure.
right? Like you kind of the second return to Ravnica. I think it was Ravnica Allegiance. I'm sorry if I got that wrong.
I think it sounds right.
Yeah,
Something
Yeah,
like
it
that.
was like Ravnica. No, it was.
Ravnica
Yeah, it
something.
was Ravnica City of Guilds, then Ravnica Allegiance. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
so
always get the. Yeah.
yeah, the latest one was the one that when it came out, me and my friend felt like it didn't have any real flavor behind it. It
Hmm.
didn't feel like
No, I felt
Ravnica.
that
It was like,
too.
oh, we're just jumping from one plane to another. Strixhaven, even though Strixhaven, I think there's some really cool cards in it. It also has that type of feeling where it just feels like we're just on another plane. Here's some more Golgari cards, and that's the theme of the
Hmm.
set. Or guilds are the theme of the set again. Um, and I think that some of that could equate with specifically with Ravnica at the time was like maybe we were too burnt out on it, and instead of taking a step back and kind of grabbing some of the flavor, we were more worried about like, oh, I need to win this week, and I need to
Right.
make sure that
Hmm.
I have these cards to smash this deck at this event or whatever. And I don't know. I think that for me, I have definitely learned a lot from when I started playing Magic. I never thought that we'd be really like I would be releasing like a sideboard guide on blue white control because back in the day, I mean most people who know me know I just play green or red. But I've come this far in understanding what all the decks do, understanding what all the cards do, and as a competitive player, the reasons that I've had success in the past was because of that, because I knew what my opponents were playing. And to a point that you have both made today is that find a deck, whether it's a deck you found online or a deck that you made, and if it's something you really like, get good at it.
Hmm.
Right.
Because Modern is the best example. This is why I really, really love Modern as a format. No matter what the best deck is in Modern, you could bring one of these decks that has been around since Modern's inception, and just because you know how to play it, you're going to beat
Right.
most people there.
Right.
Hmm.
Because you've jammed 1,000 games with it. Whereas maybe
Piloting.
almost all the people that you played against at that day maybe played like 300-400. And then, okay, you might lose to the one person who gets the draw or hits the hate piece against you.
Yeah.
So that's going to happen. But, as long as you know what you're doing, like when I've had success in Magic, it's because I have been playing Abzan for like 6 months. It's because, I've been playing Infect and Tron for almost a year. You know what I mean? It's because I've been playing these strategies over and over and over again to the point that you can just like do it in your sleep, and even some of the tougher decisions get a lot easier because you
Hmm.
start to understand, you see the game. That's why I think people give a really bad rep to a lot of these net, like you're saying, the net deckers and or people who grind a lot, but they're actually the true artists because they've taken the time to see every possible outcome that they can out of how much time they've been able to put into those games. So
Hmm.
therefore, whenever they play a game, most of the time they can already say, "Oh, I mean, I've been here before. This is the same
Sure.
situation I've
It's
been."
kind of like speed running.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, these are
Yeah.
some of the same cards that I know that my opponent has, so I'm just going to do this. This is how I get around it, and then we can move the game to here because that's how pros play, right? Like pros see the
Hmm.
game a few turns ahead, right? And they also know how to like threat assessment and value what's the most important aspect of the game in that moment, like what they need to be doing. And at the end of the day, that really just comes down to the fact that that pro has played like 1,000, however
Right.
many. I'm just using that number, however many
Hmm.
games with that deck, like thousands of games, so they know what to do at
Yeah.
that moment.
Well, I remember. Yeah, I remember there was a particular play at the World Championship. I think it was like 2 years ago now, where somebody based on what needed, like they were going up against red aggro, I think, and they were playing a blue white control deck, and they cast emergency powers
Oh
and
my
then
god.
cast their own absorb, countering their emergency powers. They spent like 10 mana, and the only effect was they gained 3 life, but it bought them another turn and they ended up winning the game.
Oh my gosh.
Like because that was a pro looking at this board and it's like, well, what do I need? I could draw a whole fresh
Wow.
7. with this, and I'll die, or I
Stomping your
gain
own
the 3
creature.
life, and I
You've
mean,
seen it before, right,
I've
guys? Like
seen it.
that stuff
stomping your own
happens.
creature, because I
Mm-hmm.
would rather stomp my creature and get my bone crusher
Yep.
rather than you getting 2 for 1, right?
Yeah.
You
Oh, and
killing my card and then you getting your bone crusher. It
Or
doesn't even matter
lightning
if I get to play
helix.
my bone crusher. It's gonna
yes.
suck even more, right? If we end up taking too far behind, or like OhOneNine's point of your opponent's trying to gain some life and you're like, nah,
Right.
just cut down my own card. I did
Yeah.
that the other day. It's like, I think I'll just cut down my own underdog, so then that way I can just bring the underdog back on
Mm-hmm.
the following turn.
Yeah. Well,
That
and
feels a lot better.
that's a situation like you talk about Stomp or like Brazen Borrower. If your opponent is casting, or Murder Strider too, if your
Mhm.
opponent is casting an adventure spell, you need to be aware how the game interacts. If you prevent that spell from resolving, it goes to their graveyard. They don't get the creature.
Right.
They don't have access to the creature later. You're cutting off a resource.
It
You
doesn't
2-for-1
resolve.
them by
Yep.
doing that. And so, yeah, is it a good idea to generally use cut down or fatal push to kill your own thing? Well,
No.
no. But like obviously you don't want to be killing your own creatures. But in that situation, totally might be worth it. Yeah,
Oh yeah,
totally
100%.
might be worth it.
And I think that a lot of people don't do that enough. Like in game 1,
Mhm.
that's actually how I go into control nowadays. I'm like, okay, if they have exile, exile removal, then I gotta save my
Yep.
removal spells if my stuff has recursion, because I gotta kill it, or I gotta kill it in response so they don't gain life. In game 1, you're
Yes.
trying to get the max value that you can out of these dead cards, or else you're gonna be sitting there like, oh, I mean, yeah, I guess I'll let them destroy my creature and gain 4. Oh, they just have everything. It's like, no, you should have just fatal pushed your card,
Mhm.
because yeah, you're 2-for-1ing yourself, but it's literally a dead card and you're stopping your opponent from doing something that goes against your strategy.
Yeah.
It's all like, you gotta play Magic. You gotta play a lot of Magic to see these
Mhm.
lines. The other day I did one. It actually was yesterday on stream. I had a sleeper. I forget what it's called.
The Evolve Sleeper?
I had an
Yeah.
evolved sleeper in play, and it was a 4/4. So it was a 3/3,
Mm.
and it had a +1/+1 counter on it. So I
Okay.
attack, and my opponent plays a card that's like Valor Stance. I think it's like destroy an enchantment or destroy a creature power toughness 4 or greater, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
Something like that. It's 2 mana
Yep.
instant. So I
That we
attack.
talked
They,
about
they have a
earlier.
token to block with. I attack, and they try to play it. And I sit there and I'm like, oh, I've been waiting for the moment to do this play. So I use the first ability on Evolve Sleeper, make it a 2/2, which essentially only makes it a 3/3. So now their card that destroys a creature with toughness 4 or greater literally does nothing.
Right.
And then my opponent only had
right.
like 1 card left, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm just solid now, and they can block with their token, but I pretty much just stopped them
That's
from
brilliant.
killing my
Yeah.
card. And those plays don't come up because most of the time you'd be sitting there, you'd be like, oh, this is terrible. But now my value card that I've sunk 8 mana into is dead. It's like, no, just spend the 1 mana again, make it smaller. It
Mhm.
survives, and then later on you can start boosting it again, and it doesn't even change anything. Just those small plays are what
Sure.
really make or break it. Like countering
Mhm.
your own spell.
Totally.
I used to do that in Legacy. I would play like Monastery. I played I don't know if the red blue Prowess deck still exists, but the Is It Prowess deck back in my day was pretty good. It doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, we would play that, and then you can kind of like force a will and daze your own cards. So then you can get like your 2 Swiss Spears up to like 8 or 9
Mhm.
power, and you just kill your
Sure.
opponent with Fire
Yeah.
Blast and all this other stuff. So I always thought that was like
Well,
interesting, right? You just have to like figure lines
yeah.
out, play the game.
Well, and that's also a hidden mode on Urtai Resurrected, a card that just came out in Dominaria. It says to counter an activated or triggered ability or destroy a creature or planeswalker, and then that the controller of that ability or spell or creature or planeswalker draws a card. So I've used Urtai. I've had like a Liliana on board. My opponent has Pithing Needled it. Well, I can't use it, so I just throw Urtai, blow up my own Liliana, and draw a card.
Right. Right.
You know, like
Understand when the
you can
card
do that
draw.
kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
can tripping at the cost of something that's less valuable or has no
Mhm.
value.
Yep.
Yeah. Or you could like chump block a lifelinker and then use Urtai to kill the thing that's chump blocking so they don't get the
Mhm.
life off the lifelink. That kind of thing. Like those little edge cases can make a huge difference.
I used to
Yeah.
banishing priest my own creatures against control in game 1. So that way I
Okay.
still had a creature out, and if they wanted to board wipe, then I would just get my own creature back
That's
anyways.
awesome.
Like subtle things like that are kind of weird to do. Where
Hmm.
like I said, like you're just trying to get the most value out of your cards. And I think thinking outside the box is something that I don't actually see a lot of players do anymore.
Hmm.
The cards are all so powerful nowadays that you kind of just play them, and they already
Yeah,
do so much that you're kind of like
that's true.
forgiven. You don't like
Right.
Right.
have that much. e- Even if you make a decision that's like the 60% decision compared to the 85% decision, you still have like just as much of a chance of winning anyways because you still made like a 60%
Hmm.
decision or whatever, right? Like it's weird. It's a true testament to where Magic cards are now.
Well, I know we're coming up on time here, but I also wanted to mention, like you kind of were talking about destroying your own thing and kind of interaction, how it's changed in modern. With Goif, Tarmogoyf has gone through so many different variations throughout the years in terms of its potency. I mean, there was a time when Tarmogoyf was a $60 card.
It was 200
This is
bucks.
long before.
It
Oh,
was
was it even
200
that high?
bucks. Yeah.
I didn't even know it was that high. And
Yeah.
this is before obvious multiple reprints and things like that. But more so, talking about interaction. So, it's power and toughness boosted by the number of different types of permanents in graveyard. Well, if you are tactical in your things like, surgical extraction or things that target the graveyard and you're in combat and they swing, you can actually change the power and toughness of that creature based on interacting with their graveyard, not even interacting with the creature
Hmm.
itself. We don't have a lot of that right now in standard explorer or historic. I wish we had more of that,
Hmm.
like instant speed, and there's certainly a lot more that's available. It would definitely warp the format if we had things like a surgical extraction, but I mean, we do have more
We have
expensive
something that's like
versions.
Relic that came out in Crimson Vow. I forget what it's called, but it's actually exactly like Relic of Progenitus, except for
Mm,
that it's only when it comes in and exiles a card. You don't get to make your opponent keep doing it, but you get to use a one-time effect. I think that the closest thing that we're gonna get to it for a while is gonna be Hearse, just
Yeah.
because Hearse is just like a
mm,
continual graveyard hate. It's not like a I got you like a
right,
Ravenous Trap or anything like that, but it's still like a incremental like just getting rid of some cards in your yard slowly. Like you just can
right.
never have a graveyard. I think that that's like really important, and you do make a really good point about Tarmogoyf. Having played Modern, sometimes in Tron you're like, oh, these relics are dead, but it's like, no, I mean this relic's great. It draws me a card and shrinks their Goyf down to 0 power. It's pretty good to
There you
me.
go.
Can definitely save you in the early parts of the game when they got like a couple 5/6s down and you're just trying
Hmm.
to
Right.
not die, and you're thinking you got some dead cards, but you literally have the answer in your hand.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and Tarmogoyf is a good example, but cards with variable stats are in all kinds of formats. And, just thinking of standard right now, we have the Urborg Lurgoyf and Old Stick Fingers, both of which care about the number of creatures in your graveyard. If you're going up against that, targeted graveyard hate can go a long way. If you have one on your board, something as simple as a blood token, if you have a creature in your hand, could also be a buff to your creature.
Right, right. And,
So,
and they did print
yeah.
a new Goyf. I forget the exact name of it. It is green white,
Hmm.
and it's equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard as opposed to the different types. Tarmogoyf is, of course, all the different types, but the new one they just printed, and actually, I think I was sharing with you guys earlier in my recent pre-release. But yeah, no, you're right. There are a handful of them recently printed.
Hmm.
yeah, there's definitely and Tarmogoyf's like a good example because like nowadays, uh, like they just printed Urborg, Goyf or whatever, Urborg Lord
Yeah, the
Goyf,
Urborg Lurgoyf.
and
Yeah.
most people probably didn't even really know what they probably like read the card and were like, this card sucks. But then like most of us were like, no, that card's cool because it's like this old card that I remember, and they're like, okay, grandma, like that meme, type of
Hmm.
situation because
Right.
back in the day, you could be like, back in the day, you're like, oh man, 2 mana, 3/3. You're like, yo, have you seen Watch Wolf? They just spoiled this card. You're like, they just spoiled
Dude,
this card.
Washable.
It's
Yes.
a green and a white, 3/3. And you're like, what do you mean? What's the drawback? You're like, no drawback.
No,
You're like, oh, I don't even
no
care if it doesn't have
drawback.
abilities. You're like, that trades with most things at 2 mana.
Oh yeah.
And then
No,
nowadays, like
yeah, that card was amazing. Yeah.
pack leader,
Actually,
like
to
pack
this
leader is like the
day,
most broken Watch Wolf ever.
right? To this day, like I got my dad into Magic as well, and we started back in the early 2000s. So Ravnica came out shortly after he got into it. To this day, when a new set comes out, he's like, "So what's the Watch Wolf in this one?" Like that's his benchmark for like what is just a bomb like uncommon.
Pack
Like it's
leader.
just that. Well, yeah, but
That's the best watch wolf, and they're it's crazy because they have printed a lot of variants of that card recently, like 2 mana 3/3s, but like
Right.
some of them don't get played because they don't have abilities. Like just being vanilla isn't gonna
Mhm.
cut it
Grizzly
anymore.
Bears,
Like your
R.I.P.
yeah, your
Well,
card's got to do something. I mean, I think we're
yeah.
Yeah.
getting close to there was a statistic. I don't know if I saw it on Twitter or it was on Reddit, but there's only like a handful of vanilla cards left, and it's
Mhm.
like getting less and less every set. So we might actually get to a point here pretty soon where every single card has an ability.
Well, they've talked about the termination of core sets, and there was an article that came out about a year and a half ago where the justification of bad cards, and it was a WotC article that they wrote, and it was, why would you print a 3 mana 3/2 vanilla card? It has no play outside of limited, and even then,
Mhm.
it's a hard
It's like a
argument.
1.5. It's
Yeah,
like gonna
and
make your
Yeah.
deck if you need it.
the reason those cards are printed, they said, is that what they do for new players, and which is why they're in core sets and not some of the other expansions, right? Because once upon a time, the way Magic was constructed is we had core sets, and then we had the expansions, which were thematic, and they had accompanying stories. We've talked about this in previous podcasts. They had accompanying stories and and lore and themes that spanned across three sets that were a block. Blocks don't exist anymore. With fire and the way that cards are being printed at such high frequencies, we lost a lot of that. But the reason that they print that cards like that, vanilla cards, are being printed is what they do is they establish a point in the sand for a new player who's approaching the game for the first time and is trying to understand this game and saying to themselves, well, what is a good card? I have no reference for what is good
Mhm.
because all of these cards have such an incredible volume of text if you approach it. Now, where a 3 mana 3/2 soldier creature, which is arguably a hyper mediocre card, which is just kind of whatever, only playable in very thin, limited formats. What that card is important for, though, is establishing markers along the way that tell a new player what is good, what is bad, and it allows them to kind of gauge how things go. Because, like you said,
Mhm.
Pizza, with everything having an encyclopedia of text, it's daunting for new players. It's jarring to try and establish what the boundaries are for what a good card can be.
Yeah, and we all speak like jargon. Like most of us, it's so hard for like new players because most of us are kind of like shortening or using
Right,
like we'll be
right,
like triome,
right,
and I'm sure someone's like, "What do they mean
right.
by triome?" It's like, well,
Eight
the new
cast,
Capenna tap
mud,
lands. That's what we mean.
right.
And they're like,
Mhm.
"Well, why are they called triomes?" And then
Blink,
now you have to
flicker.
explain to them that there was a
Yeah.
set called Ikoria, and then all of a sudden now you're a half hour in this conversation, and now you're talking about companions. So I mean, like,
Right.
the game
Right.
is like so it's just so ridiculously complex. It's like it shows on the cards nowadays like
Yeah.
how much more complex it is than ever. I mean, this is
Mhm.
we're starting to get to a point where yeah, like the cards. I thought that we were gonna get less wordy, and then Strixhaven came out, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of text. And I was like,
Oh yeah.
learns and lessons, all that's a
Not to mention the
lot, and
deans. Oh my goodness. The
nighttime is
deans.
another thing where nighttime like
Mhm.
I am so used to how nighttime used to work that I forget how it actually works now.
Mhm.
And it's just so it's there's so much like complexity to it. You're right. As like a new player, like just remember to take your time.
Yeah.
There's no
Sure.
difference as a new player to kind of if you are a new player watching this to kind of give you a little bit of like at least like some reassurance. It's like you know you think you're out of the woods. Well, I mean, there's players who've been playing this game for 20 years and they're still out of the woods. I
Right.
mean, you know what I mean? Like the game is so complex that like you can't really expect yourself to automatically be good at the game, and then even when you do end up learning the game pretty well, like we all make mistakes all the time. We all tap our mana wrong. We all play the wrong card, click the wrong thing in real life. It happens too, where maybe you forgot to say trigger, or
Mhm.
oh, I drew my card and I did my Dark Confidant trigger and all this other stuff. Um, there's a lot going on all the time, but just remember, take your time. I know we got a little bit off topic today, but I hope that at least like in the time that you've been able to spend with us, you've learned a lot more about deck building and your approaches to Magic in general. Because a lot of what we talked about isn't even. We weren't even talking about a specific format most of the time. We were just using them as examples. You know, just remember what your archetypes are. Remember, what the best decks are. Always use websites like Goldfish, MTGA Zone, MTG Meta. There's all these
Aether
websites.
Hub.
Yeah, MTG
Mm-hmm.
Decks. There's all these websites out there that give you tons of information, and there's so many people that are against net decking. But these people who are against net decking, if they actually sat there and looked at the decks, they might actually win more because maybe they can build their decks a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Is all
Sure.
I'm trying to say. So use your resources to your maximum
Absolutely.
potential. Watch YouTube videos. I remember when I was grinding, I always had YouTube videos on in the background, some podcasts, kind of like getting a little bit more of an edge, kind of like learning a lot more about the game. And you can take all this and then you can kind of like essentially find your own path to kind of what you want to get out of Magic and kind of like what type of decks and cards you want to end up playing. HamHocks and OhOne, you guys got any closing remarks here?
Yeah.
I think kind of reiterating what we've already been talking about. Play the game you enjoy and have fun playing it. Remember, just to have fun.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. Yeah, if you enjoy the process of building your decks and experimenting, I mean, that's why I do it. It's because I enjoy it. It's not because it's the right thing to do. Play your game, have fun, and yeah, enjoy yourself out there. It's a good time.
There's a lot of times I play like 62 cards after sideboard. You know what?
Totally.
I literally
Yeah.
don't care, and I will still win and have success and enjoy doing what I'm doing and just have fun with the game because I don't care. I've been, most of us here talking have been playing the game for at least like 15 years. Like we've been playing for a long time, so we don't
Oh yeah.
even like, we're just trying to have the most fun that we can now.
Oh yeah.
And
My
I think
draft
that's the
decks have the
approach you always want.
my draft decks have the power 41 all the time. Like
Oh
all
yeah.
the time.
Team
It's all
41,
good.
That's the
let's go.
lucky
I'm
card.
I'm that guy,
That's
exactly.
the 4-leaf clover on top.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Hey, sometimes you just got too many good cards. You don't want to cut them,
Mm-hmm.
That's
You all
right.
got 'em. Yep.
Nothing wrong with 18 lands every once in a while, but I'm sure everyone listening right now is like, I hate you. Oh, I'm such a purist. But
Yeah. Yeah. If they
uh,
could, they would go down to 10 cards. All the Doomsday players are like, why do you need all the Doomsday players are like, why do you need more than 5 cards?
Yeah, that's all you need, right?
but anybody who's stuck around this far, if you haven't already and you've enjoyed the content, hit the subscribe button, bell notification, like the video, leave a comment down below. Would be greatly appreciated. You can find links as well to all of our content in the description below. We all stream on Twitch and also have respective YouTubes, so definitely get in on that action. Speaking of action, don't forget we host 3 tournaments a month. All are free to play with cash prizes as well. I'm not sure. I actually think this may come out on the day that we're having a tournament. So, our more recent one, if this comes out after, but the one on September 11th is going to be Explorer, and then we also have one September 25th that's Explorer as well. So, if you like to play some of these older cards, if you've invested in these anthologies, you definitely got tournaments that you're going to be able to play these cards in because we host them. So, get in on that action. I really hope that you've enjoyed your time with us today. Take another bite of that pizza and stay cheesy. See you next time, everybody.
So yes.